Thanks very much, Rana, and thanks to Zara and to Stephen and to the rest of the people, Janine as well at Auckland Art Gallery for inviting me. It's a great privilege to be here and to have the opportunity to discover a bit about the New Zealand art scene, and particularly I have to say to discover the 4 artists in the Walters Art Prize, which has been a real pleasure and also a discovery for me in the sense of not knowing much of their work before and being really impressed by all 4 projects that I've had the pleasure of getting involved in the last couple of days. And I'd like to congratulate all the 4 artists if they are indeed here. Or even if they aren't, I'd like to congratulate them. And also to say that I haven't made the decision yet, but I hope that, but I hope I will. I kind of, you know, the whole expectation is that I do make a decision, so I suppose I will do that. But also to say that I think that what I've been impressed by is the fact that there's a relationship between all the works which somehow looks at a repurposing or reframing of experiences or even of social behaviours, which I hope might resonate to some extent with the talk that I'm giving today, which will be more about the museum or the relationship between artists and museums and museum practice. I decided to focus on that because we're in a museum here, even though it's called a gallery, it's a museum. And it's a place I think that's also trying to find a possibility for how to construct such an institution in the current circumstances. And I think this is really what I want to try and talk about today is going to go from a rather abstract discussion about how the world looks like, if you like. It's quite ambitious and at quite a level of abstraction that where the museum is placed within a wider context, an economic, a political, a social context, which I think we need to try and understand in order to understand how institutions might fit into them, and then how artistic practice might fit in within institutional practice into that wider circuit. So in a sense, the compulsion I think that we have, and particularly at this moment in time, which I'll try and understand, this contemporary moment, this moment where we're in a sense transitioning from a set of modern paradigms which are still contained within all our bodies and contained within all our architectures and contained within all our understandings of how hierarchies work, how relationships work, that we're transitioning out of that, something which is you know, essentially we could date that back to the Renaissance or certainly to the French Revolution, to those key moments in Western society where Western society determined the fate of the globe in many terms by claiming itself to be universal, by claiming itself to be applicable in all conditions. Now that process is one that I think we're transitioning out of. What we're transitioning to is not yet clear. That's in a way the things that don't exist that we are trying to talk about in the São Paulo Biennale. But this transition itself is the one that we're caught in, and how do we respond to that? And this is what I'll try and talk about today, moving from this rather abstract level, which I'll hope you'll forgive me because it seems necessary to sketch out where I think and where we as an institution of an Abbemuseum think we are, and then to move to quite concrete projects. I've got 4 projects which I'll talk about. I hope I'll have time to do it, but I also want to allow time for questions. So I'll try and keep fairly closely to the script so that we can also have a time to discuss some of these things. So this is in a sense what I'm going to talk about: archives, contemporaneity and artistic agency. Archives because I think that our histories are the ways in which we can determine not only our present but also the future. In a sense, you can think about it as a compass, you know, and that the back end of the compass is the history. And unless we can change the direction of the compass, then the direction we'll go forwards is already determined by where we're coming from. So already this sort of arrow, which is of course a very modern concept, you know, of the arrow of progress, of movement through time being a linear process, is something which we're already having to understand as changing, as being in processes where cyclical time, where time that no longer relates to an idea of progress, to things getting better, to things getting bigger, to growth, yeah? All these fundamental mythologies, if you like, fundamental belief systems in which modernity has invested itself, all those things are coming up for question. So therefore, unless we can address the archives, and by archives I mean in a very general sense, so I'm talking about museum collections, artworks, but equally well archives that exist in other formats and other places. Unless we can repurpose, reuse those archives in order to understand that there might be other futures available, that there might actually be alternatives available, then I think it's going to be difficult for us to do that. And of course, in that process, an institution like a museum and I think particularly working in parallel and in collaboration with artistic practice, with contemporary artistic practice, has a real role, has a reason to exist. Suddenly these collections that we have, which might traditionally be thought of as treasure chests, you know, rather like the pirate treasure chest, which he opens up to prove his power in a sense by showing all the shiny baubles that are inside it. You know, in a sense, that's the ideology of the museum as we inherit it from modernity. But how can we move from that idea of the treasure chest to the idea of the collection as a tool, yeah, a tool for unpicking that history, rewriting that history, structuring it, restructuring it, and therefore allowing alternative futures to emerge. And that seems to be, in general, the challenge that we've got. And the final point within this, so this shift from the modern to the contemporary is important, but also then what can art do in these circumstances? What is the agency of the artist? What is the agency, indeed, of the art institution? What is it that makes, that art can say, I can to, or can answer the question, I can, by saying, this is what art can do in this circumstance. It obviously can't do everything. We might ask, as I think some more cynical critics would ask, whether it can do anything at all. But its possibility, I think, is something that we need to reinvestigate, because in the reconfigured situation, which is the contemporary, then the agency of art itself changes. And maybe questions of originality, of creation, you know, the creative industries that have taken over so much of that. The idea, you know, Boyce's modernist notion of everyone becoming an artist has now become something written into most city plans in terms of economic development when we talk about creativity. Everyone an artist is also a flexible worker, a precarious worker, somebody who determines their own identity rather than has that determined for them through their job and through their security that might offer. So this everyone an artist has turned completely around, in a sense. From being a liberating force, it's become almost an oppressive force, yeah? A force that casualizes labor. So in this circumstance, what is artistic agency? And I'm going to try and suggest, hopefully relatively concretely, a few projects that might point the way. But these are, of course, all modest proposals, if you like. They're all ideas that are still in the process of becoming. Because we are in a transitional phase, and in this transitional phase, becoming is more important than arriving. Emerging, and through the emerging, starting to learn what works and what doesn't work, becomes a very important practice. And again, something that, in a sense, the public funding and the public space of art, through its public institutions, is very precious for. It's precious for that old-fashioned modern idea of experimentation. But it's precious also because it allows us to see what might function in the world to come. Now, I'm going to talk largely about the Van Abbemuseum, so I thought I'd just show you some images of it so you knew where it was. So this is the institution that was built in 1936, and in a sense was one of the early modern museums, modern contemporary at its time, yeah, but contemporary didn't have the loading that I'm trying to give it here and that I think many other people are trying to do. But this was a museum that was opened as a modern museum with a provincial collection from the Netherlands and from Belgium, but nevertheless of works that had been produced in the 1920s and 1930s. If we think about the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is a sort of archetypal modern institution, that institution was founded in 1929 but acquired its first works for the collection in 1936 as well. So almost coterminous with it. Of course, the kind of collection that it had was very different from the one that we were established with. And also in 1936, one of the big collections, the Emanuel Hoffmann collection or foundation in Basel, was also set up as a contemporary collection in 1936 as well. So there was something around this period of the 30s, the period which, you know, as most of you have European roots, you'll understand it's a period of particular conflict, of particular antagonism with the rise of fascism. That at the same time, this is a period where the idea of the institution that might collect the contemporary, that might collect its own time, begins to be born. And then in 2014, it had a huge increase in its space, which is kind of, again, you know, this actually opened in 2003, but this is an image from recently of it. So 2003, a project which had begun in the 80s to enlarge the museum, project which always takes about 20 years, especially dealing with public money and having to justify it. I think New Plymouth is going through the same kind of processes now that a small town like Eindhoven, maybe quite similar to New Plymouth in some way, went through from the 80s onwards. And the building was finally opened in 2003, and I became director in 2004. But this idea, in a sense, of enlarging the real estate became a very paradigmatic idea in which museums dealt with what I would say would be the beginning of this transitional phase. If we think about this transitional phase beginning around the time of the end of communism, the beginning of the internet, the times in the 80s when neoliberalism becomes the discourse, and I'll come back and try to explain that this period of the 80s from around the election of Ronald Reagan or so in 1980 or Margaret Thatcher in 79 through until the end of communism is really this period where the assertion of a new order is taking place. And then after 89 there's this assertion of literally a new world order under the first Bush and under various other Western leaders. And that assertion was responded to by the museums very much in terms of the paradigmatic capitalist idea of growth. So what happened is that museums got hugely bigger all over the world. And in a sense, they didn't really address their purpose so much as their size. So the dialogue in the 90s and in the 2000s was very much about getting bigger because the collections were getting bigger, because the world was getting bigger, because the economy was getting bigger. But as we know from our bodies, getting bigger is not necessarily the most healthy thing you can do, at least once you're 16 or 17. So growth itself is not necessarily a paradigm that works, or at least cannot be sustained continuously. And that's something we've seen, obviously, in the last 5 or 6 years with various economic and also environmental challenges, that idea of growth itself is not necessarily sustainable. So that's why I suggest here that maybe what we're doing is working in a place which is in a sense already anticipating its destruction, already anticipating the fact that it will be a ruin at some point. It will be a modern ruin which will be located in a contemporary time. And that's in a sense the dilemma, the paradox that we have, because in this transition, the tools that we have to use in order to prepare ourselves for what is to come, what is becoming, are precisely the modern tools that we inherit from the past. They're precisely the modern architecture, but also the modern architecture of the mind that we inherit. And this process of necessarily having to use that architecture, mental as well as physical, that architecture of the past in order to construct something which we can begin to call contemporary maybe, is a very, I think, a very appropriate way of understanding where and how we might be. So it's not about abandoning the modern. It's not even about necessarily having a critical relationship in a classic sort of postmodern sense towards that modern history. It's simply accepting that it's finished. It's accepting that its discourse has come to an end, that there's no dynamism left in the old modernity that we were faced with from, as I say, either the Renaissance or from the French Revolution in the late 18th century. That dynamic has run its course. We can be mournful, we can be nostalgic, we can be fearful, which are very much a lot of the reactions that we see in the political or even in the economic sphere. But we can also start to prepare. But preparing has to be built on the ground that we have, and that's a modern ground. What I'm trying to point out here and relate to, I suppose, is a correlation to the idea of history and also of memory, which are of course very intimately related, which I think a number of artists are pointing out or pointing towards, are asking us to consider what history might be and how we have to construct it. Now, I wanted to juxtapose this now with a short section or short quote from I think one of the most interesting philosophers still of this time. He's been interesting for the last 70 years, but he somehow still contains in the huge amounts of his writings something which is crucial to our understanding. It's Walter Benjamin, and his this is written in 1940, so just before he commits suicide on the Spanish border, when he's thinking about history, and in a way thinking in a certain parallel sense, more ideological, more modern, of course. And he talks about what history is in this little section, which is kind of fragments, thoughts that are written that don't really fit necessarily to one another, sometimes contradict each other. But this little section seems to me to be important if we think about those archives and those museums and the functions that we have as an institution to write those histories, to tell those narratives. Yeah? Maybe not our narrative, maybe a narrative we inherit from the Museum of Modern Art in New York or from some other place of power, yeah, but nevertheless that the museums reproduce those kind of narratives which are already set up. And he says this in, I think, a very liberating sentence for anybody that's a curator or anybody that's an artist that wants to refer to their past. To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. That's really helpful, no? It sort of opens up a possibility that, okay, we're not accountable for what actually happened. It's not what we're interested in. It's not what we're engaging with when we think historically, when we live in historical times. We're not in our heads or physically. That this idea of accounting for the way it really was is not in any way a relationship that we want to engage with. Rather, it means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. Remember, this is somebody who's writing about photography, so this idea of flash also has a very solid sort of concrete notion of capturing an image, maybe in the dark, that flashes up at a moment of danger, which is important. Flashes up at a moment of danger, so in other words, the moment of danger itself is the definition of why the flash is triggered, of why the moment in history becomes significant. Historical materialism wishes to retain that image of the past, which unexpectedly appears to man, singled out by history at this moment of danger. The danger, and of course he's talking in 1940, we know very much what the danger is, but I think that he, or at least we, can agree that we are always in a moment of danger. The nature of the danger might change, but danger is always present. The severity of the danger might change, but danger is always present. The danger, in other words, this reason that the flash is triggered, affects both the content of the tradition, the idea of history. And the content of the tradition is the traditional version. For instance, in art, the version that comes through Alfred Barr from the Museum of Modern Art, if you like. The content of that tradition is affected by the nature of the moment of danger. And it affects its receivers, the people that are on the other end. The same threat hangs over both the content of the tradition and the receivers, the people that are taking this in, and on the basis of that, we would imagine what he says later on the basis of that, making our choices, deciding actions, on the basis of the content of the tradition which we receive, because what else can we decide our actions on except on what we know, except on what we believe we know of a past that actually has nothing to do with the way it really was. So you see again this destabilizing of the relationship to a secure past, which I think is incredibly enabling. It gives us agency, and I think artists are interested in that process through the liberation that this indicates from history, but also the clear implication in the text that there's another danger which looms over that history, and that's this: the same threat hangs over both, that of becoming a tool of the ruling classes. Now, we think about what we might call the oligarchization of society in the last 20 years. This idea of the ruling classes, I think, is something which we can, maybe not in the Marxist terms in which he's addressing it. It might seem to be very old-fashioned, but if we understand it in terms of oligarchies, in terms of the power that's vested in those oligarchies through their control of the media, through their implication in the governing system, in a way which is far from any notion of democratic one person, one vote, but is far more to do with much deeper levels of influence, that in that process we might understand the ruling classes as being still a very relevant term today. So the same threat hangs over both, that of becoming a tool of the ruling classes. And in a way, I think here in this final sentence, he gives almost an instruction to the museums. He gives an instruction to the public institutions that are responsible, as museums are, for telling history. Museums are, to some extent, history machines. They produce history themselves. They produce history through the narratives that they tell. And many museums tell the same narrative. It's a narrative that, as I say, we inherit largely from the Museum of Modern Art, or to some extent from a few other Western European institutions. And that change is something that he talks about here very clearly. In every attempt, in every era, the attempt must be made anew to wrest tradition away from a conformism that is about to overpower it. And that conformism seems precisely to be the conformism of those central narratives which have been locked in. The narratives of art history that we have, but also the narrative of art's relationship to to the world, to society. I was talking earlier about Colin McCann and the fact that he was a curator here for many years and also had a certain political activism, but how much those aspects of his work are written out when a big exhibition happened in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam some years ago. How he became this figure, this sort of rather outsider, genius come slightly quirky artist, and how that whole production happens because the conformism of what an artist is has overcome a narrative which might allow other aspects to be equally as important as those that have been presented. So that's just a local example, but I think we can reproduce that example many times over, all the way from Picasso to the contemporary artists in the Walters Art Prize and how they fit into legacies. You know, it's interesting how in the texts as well, how much there's an attempt to connect their work to certain legacies of performance art or certain legacies of durational performance, durational activities that artists have been doing since the 70s onwards. So we're always looking for these lineages, yeah? Always looking to tell that history. And one of the questions I think that this emerges out of this text is the extent to which that is a conformist attitude. Yeah? It's an attitude which is constantly threatening us. I mean, it's not something which is surprising. It's not something which we should talk again about good and bad, about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that these things happen. We should simply acknowledge it. And the help that we have from a writer like Benjamin or from an artist like Rabia Moray is to help us to acknowledge it. And by acknowledging it, we can do something about it, or at least know that what we're doing is part of this trajectory. So what is this moment of danger that we might be in now? Why am I talking about this tradition? Why am I saying that there are things that are not right with the world, I suppose? I think there's one little graph. I'm going to show you a graph now. There's only one. It's not a maths talk. But this is a little graph which was produced in 2003, so it's a little bit out of date now, which talks basically about on this column is the ecological footprint per capita, and this green line represents the sustainability line. Yeah, so above this line, the amount of resources that an individual or a society uses are not sustainable, are not replaced in the world by the consumption is higher than the replacement capacity of the earth itself. And on this side of this line here is what we call what the UN call the Human Development Index, the acceptable Human Development Index that we might have, which is health, which is education, which is those values which are, just all the process of the last 20 years have been those values have been monetarized, have been seen in terms of education being an investment in the individual. That's how it's presented now in most Western societies and even outside the West. Rather than being an investment in society, being an investment in the individual. Here you see it very much as you see it here as an investment in society, because it's an investment in the Human Development Index which allows a society to be sustainable, just as much as the green line is about sustainability. The blue line is also about sustainability. So you can see the direction of travel generally of the world is like this, conveniently missing the little box where we would both fit into a human sustainability and a human development which was acceptable. Yeah, but the direction of travel in 2003, and a lot of these dots have moved in this direction since, heading for New Zealand here, slightly below Australia. I don't know if you're happy or sad about that. But many of the Western countries, the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, Russia beginning to join in, you see these various countries and how they're moving. Saudi Arabia, neither sustainable nor at an acceptable human development level, etc., etc. One state, which in 2003 was actually in the box, in the place that the rest of the world might want to go to. And as I say, in the 10 years or 11 years intervening, this has not been improved. In fact, as far as the UN can tell, I read today when I was checking it, Cuba has now left this box and is no longer actually in it. So it's in the last 10 years, in the intervening period, actually there's been a regression rather than a progression, if we can use a modernist term for a moment. There's been a regression away from the intended target, which is this little box here. So this points out, I think, one of the consequences of modernization, because what's happening here is that all these countries are still modernizing, yeah? And still using these terms, still embracing the idea of the modern, which these countries here have embraced for the last 100, 150, 200 years. Yeah, so this process is one in which, according to modern thinking, the sort of idea that we're all linked on a train basically, and you have the United States somewhere in the driver's seat, and somewhere at the back is Niger or Sierra Leone, but basically the train is going along the same track, and everything will develop. This is constantly how one idea of development is presented. But that train track is running into a brick wall. And if it's running into a brick wall, and I think we know this through all the climate change protests and things like that, we're clearly aware of this, but we have very little agency, artistic or otherwise, very little agency in which that might be dealt with. But this is one reason why it's running down. The next reason goes back even further than Walter Benjamin, all the way back to 1776, and to another consideration which has really become dominant in this period that I'm talking about, this period of transition which begins in the early 80s, begins under the guise of something that comes to be known as neoliberalism, at least by its opponents. The pro-neoliberals don't use that term, which is interesting. They declare themselves to be ideology-free in many ways, yeah? But we, who are rather questioning of their ideology, try to impose some term on it, and the term is neoliberal. Whether that's a good term or not, I think is something we could spend the rest of the evening discussing. But let's imagine this. So neoliberalism is actually related, or is made it has made its history, has developed its lineage, has written the past not as it really was, but as it wants to be, and it writes that past back to Adam Smith in Edinburgh in 1776, where he talks about this idea of the invisible hand. He actually, in a book which is around 700 pages in a little paperback version, he only mentions the invisible hand 3 times. It wasn't really a concept he was so wildly enthusiastic about. And I'm sure if he gave lectures, as he did at Edinburgh and then Glasgow University, they weren't called economics and the invisible hand. They had very many other terms, including the wealth of nations. But this is how he refers to it, and I think it's important because it indicates one of the difficulties that we have in the condition that we're in. He, the merchant, is in this. In other words, it says before this about the establishing of a price mechanism, basically within the market, that the merchant has to determine the price because the competitive stalls in the market, you imagine him actually in the grass market in Edinburgh or something, walking around and observing this, that in that process you see that the price somehow evens itself out, because if one stall is much higher than the rest, nothing can be sold, so therefore he has to bring his prices down to match those. So he, the merchant, is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. So intentionality has gone from this. And this is also nice as he goes on it, because I think here you can imagine him actually standing in this grass market in Edinburgh and talking to the merchants themselves. And he says, nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it, that intentionality was no part of it, that the idea of an ethical position was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it, the interests of society. I have never known much good done by those who affect to trade for the public good. It is an affectation indeed, not very common among merchants, and very few words need to be employed in dissuading them from it. Again, I think you can imagine this conversation which is going on, where Adam Smith is telling the merchants, look, don't worry about all that nonsense of having a social conscience, just go on and do what you have to do. This has been taken, when I'm talking about writing history, this has been taken because there's many, many other things in the wealth of nations which contradict this idea of an ethicless, if you like, of an unintentional society which simply produces its results as an accumulation of individual decisions. The neoliberal argument. If we all make the right decision according to the laws of the market, according to the invisible hand, then the world will be a better place. Well, I've tried to suggest that maybe that's not quite the direction of travel that we're going in. But the problem is that this argument has become so established, so ossified, so imbued into our systems of thinking, that it means that the idea of ethics in political, in artistic, in social, in economic life have almost been removed. Because why would you want to interfere with this system, which is a mechanism that doesn't need intentionality? That in fact, as Adam Smith says, intentionality interrupts it. Intentionality is something which produces a negative consequence in relationship to no intentionality. So what do we hear, if I can take you back on a short history lesson? We hear from Margaret Thatcher, very classic terms, there is no alternative. This was the argument that the neoliberals always presented, that there is no alternative to this. There is no ethics about those decisions. There is no ethics about unemployment. There is no ethics about publicness. It's simply that these things are not significant because there's another iron rule, which is the rule of the invisible hand. There is no such thing as society. It's again something that she said. She's always good for some quotes still. But this idea that she was talking about is something that simply doesn't, that allows the kind of behavior that we see in the oligarch class particularly, the kind of behavior which is value-free in terms, to be justified at a very profound level. And it becomes very, very hard to argue against this kind of position. What we have in parallel to this development of no alternative and no such thing as society, in 1989, Francis Fukuyama publishes a book called The End of History. You can see where I'm getting at, given that I'm talking about history and how important histories are and how important institutions like museums are for telling that history. What do the neoliberals do? They say, no, it's not about us telling a history and you telling a history. It's about you telling a history and us saying it's the end of history. Yeah, it's a beautiful device. It's a beautiful argument, because it simply disables you. And that's what's happened, a disabling of all the tools that we used to have to critique the society, to try and bring an ethical stance in it. And what's art if it's not about ethics? It's about the relationship between ethics, society, and the individual. So art, in a sense, also disappears in this notion of there is no alternative, in this notion of the end of history. It becomes something which suddenly is difficult to justify. And how do we justify it? We justify it on the basis of its economic productivity. We justify it on the basis of what tourism it brings into a city, or what money it makes through the commercial system, the exchange system of art, in which art becomes an exchangeable commodity. Yeah? We justify it in terms of the idea, as I said, of everyone an artist being about the creative industries, using the argument about creativity to casualize the labor force. Yeah, these are the tools that art has provided for this argument, for this position, and why it's kind of tough to think about what to do in this way. It's tough, I think, for young artists, it's tough for older curators to know how to manage the system. So I'm going to try and do now, and I think I can talk for another 10 minutes, or is that too long? Yeah. I'm going to talk about a few projects. I'm going to do it quite quickly because I've spent longer than I thought on the background. But I'm going to talk about a few projects that I hope in some sort of modest way, very modest way, try to address some of these things. Try to address the notions around sustainability, the graph that I showed you, through the idea of reuse and repurposing, particularly of the collections. In other words, not of producing new, producing something which is a new product to be presented into the market. Yeah? Again, these are things that are very understandable, and they also need to happen. It's not that this is about black and white. Yeah, but clearly, if you have this discourse of the invisible hand and what it has produced being the thing that shapes the product, but the products, which is how they're seen, yeah? However crude that seems, however unfair it seems to the creativity of the individual artist who's making this work, sometimes making amazingly beautiful, important work. Yeah? But nevertheless, that turn of that work within the system, within this transitional system, into a product is something that's unavoidable. Yeah? It's something for which there is no alternative at the moment. And so constructing an alternative has to be thought of not in terms of an individual artist's responsibility, but in terms of a systemic responsibility, in terms of the kinds of protocols we can set up in which art is distributed, in terms of the way in which art is perceived as a public good, about its intentionality, about the intentionality of the art. And all those things are not the control, or easily in the control, of an individual artist, like they're not in the control of an individual worker. Yeah, the agency of art is not in that realm of trying to change the system. The agency of artists can only be effective collectively at that level. But maybe artists can do other things, which is what we're trying to talk about. maybe they can restart history in a little bit. And I think that's something that's going on fairly rapidly at the moment if we look at the Middle East, but also in other parts of the world, that history is clearly no longer quite so ended as it once was. Or they can institute an alternative. Institute are used in a very particular sense, yeah, relation to the institution itself, but also institute in terms of the starting point. Yeah, there's an idea of constituting something, and there's that idea of instituting something. Instituting something is this moment of beginning, yeah, this moment of structuring something so that it has a form, and a form which is collective, a form which might lead to an institute. Yeah, to an institute of thought, to an institute, a physical institute like this gallery, or an institute which might be the institution of art itself, yeah, and how that works in relationship to other institutions like the institution of science. So what can artists do? What is it that artists can do in these circumstances? Well, one of the things I like is this very much, because it also has a certain humour to it, I hope, and also it is in a way that turning things upside down. Yeah, that by turning things upside down, very simply we can start to analyse or respond to the world in different ways, just by what happens when this book is being read, yeah? And what happens when that history of Hegel and Marx and everything which is somehow embedded in a certain notion of modern art is then simply turned on its head in this very slight gesture, but nevertheless perhaps very significant gesture. I always think this is a good image when I do lectures in art colleges particularly, and there's this often very heavy theoretical device, particularly in the United States, yeah, this sort of philosophy, rather empty, I find, philosophizing, you know, around certain philosophical positions, whether it's current French philosophy or it's going back to Hegel or to Kant, that this kind of somehow is a refreshing idea. Like if you actually just turned all those texts that a lot of artists or young artists are struggling to read, if you just turn them upside down, how much easier is it then to start to deal with them? Yeah? How much easier it then might be to start to digest them, or to start to find in them some impetus to start to work. Now I'm going to talk about these 4 projects, and I'll go fairly quickly for them. I think it's about using and misusing the archive, and as I say, the archive is the collection, and how also to misuse institutions. So I'll really just describe them and go through them quite quickly, and then we can move to a moment of discussion. So the first one is by Danish art group Superflex and the Van Abbemuseum, the institution that I introduced you at the beginning, called Free Soloist. They curated, Superflex, together with the curators in the museum, curated an exhibition using the collection of minimalism and conceptualism that we have in the museum. So here you see a Carl Andre, an Andy Warhol on the back wall. Here is all the videos we have of Bruce Nauman, for instance, and a Donald Judd in the middle, with the sounds of the Bruce Nauman kind of filling the hole that Judd's box has made. And here you see Ed Ruscha on the side, Stanley Brown, a Dutch conceptual minimal, interesting artist about the body. And on the back wall you see a silhouette. You see this silhouette becomes significant in a minute. So this was the exhibition, but then in the middle of the space, in the what's called the room of honor in Dutch, the Erezaal, the central space, we set up a workshop like this. So this is the workshop that functioned throughout the opening of the exhibition between 11 and 5 or 6 o'clock every day. And in this process, the workers who had proper jobs, they hadn't become artists, they were actually employed by a company, they started to produce copies. They started to produce copies of the silhouette that you saw, the original on the back wall here. Yeah? And these copies were then given away free silhouette, yeah? to the people through a lottery system. So people had to fill in a card, and then every week or every time it was produced, they started off producing about 1 a week, and by the end they were producing about 4 a week, because things get more efficient and things grow, and it becomes more easy to produce things after you get used to it for a while. And so gradually these things got distributed all over, not to some extent all over the south of the Netherlands, but also some of them went internationally. And I mean, there's lots to say about this, in terms of copyright, in terms of the original, the original intentions of Soloist. If you look at his sentences on conceptual art and his disinterest, apparent disinterest in the materiality of the idea being the thing. And the materiality simply being a necessary materialization of the idea, but not actually being that significant. Of course, then if we think about the commodity culture, the invisible hand, that's come in and plucked that apparently more or less byproduct of the idea out of its idea-ness, and made it very much into a thingness, into a thing which then has a value, and that value is ascribed to it. So what happens when you copy it, when you transgress? If anybody wants to know that story, I'll tell them later, because I want to hurry up. The next project is this, which again is about a sort of repurposing or reuse of the historic collection. To take a Picasso to Ramallah, into the Art Academy in Ramallah. In Palestine, which is a place that is occupied by the State of Israel, and a place which is traditionally associated with other kind of news and not with the Picasso exhibitions we can imagine. Ironically, there is almost an endless supply of Picassos about 20 minutes drive from Ramallah, if it was possible to go there, in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. But those Picassos are simply unavailable to most people who don't have the correct passes, or anyway, when the checkpoints are closed, it's simply inaccessible to get to Jerusalem or to get to the original Israel, the 1948 Israel. So we spent 2 years together with the International Art Academy in Palestine negotiating all the protocols for taking a Picasso to Ramallah. As you probably know, I'm sure it's true for this museum, the museum is constantly involved in loans, and there's very standard protocols and things like that, and basically they happen almost automatically, the process of loaning. Here, everything had to be built from scratch. The protocols had to be built. The idea of insurance was dependent upon the head of the insurance company actually going to Ramallah and agreeing. The fact that we could get it across the border, here it is crossing Kalandia checkpoint, is a product of a strange collaboration between the Israeli authorities and the media. The media were surrounding this truck as it was coming in so that the Israeli army wouldn't open it, because then it would become scandalous. But at the same time, the Israeli army was also aware of it and was always going to let it through. But nevertheless, you had to sort of double check these things. This whole process showed the levels of security, the levels to which it went. You can see the levels of security here, which are probably more extreme than the levels of security in Auckland, I imagine, or certainly in Eindhoven. Which is, of course, completely unnecessary if you think about it, because, where is one of the safest places to show an artwork than a place in the world surrounded completely by a wall, which is manned 24 hours a day and doesn't allow any humans out there? So how the hell an art work could escape out of the occupied part of Palestine is unknown to me. So nevertheless, it took this kind of security, and this kind of security with 2 or 3 guides always standing there like this, next to the work. And these were the kind of demands that were put on us in terms of the protocols. And this is the Palestinian Defense Force, who were, so the state, the embryonic, whatever we call it, corrupt Palestinian state, was part of the whole mechanisms in which this was produced. And it had a lot of byproducts in terms of press and media, because the interesting thing that also the Khaled Turani, who was the artist who first proposed this idea, in a similar way to Superflex, that wanted to try and discuss an idea of the place where he lives and the institution where he works in terms that are not always around the Israel-Palestine conflict and around this. So how could you change the narrative? How could you grasp that history from the conformism that is always about to overpower it? How could you do that, and you could insert another kind of circuit of knowledge, another kind of circuit of information into that circuit, into that world? And in a sense, this worked because this kind of material was produced. So in a sense, the models of what news should appear out of Ramallah were transgressed through that process of bringing the Picasso there. And also a nice anecdote, Amjad Ghanam, who's since gone on to be an artist, he was at the time in an Israeli prison, and he produced this little drawing, but using the postcard which you're allowed to send every 2 weeks to your relatives from the Israeli prison back to East Palestine, if you like. the eastern part of Palestine. And he and instead of writing to his mother, he sent this to the Art Academy. And subsequently, he was released as part of a deal to release Gilad Shalit, who was one of the soldiers captured by Hamas some years ago. And so then he was able to start and pursue an artistic career, and now he's showing quite actively. So there's a sort of nice story in which if people say what came out of this project, in a sense, this artist, Amjad, came out of this project in a certain way, in a way which is you know, sort of a happy story in a way, in a conflict zone. The third project I'm going to talk about again quickly is this is a project by Chinese artist Li Mu, who worked together with the museum on displacing the collection from Eindhoven in the Netherlands to a tiny village, which unfortunately the image is gone, but a tiny village in more or less between Shanghai and Beijing. There's a huge distance between, but if you put your finger more or less on the line between the two, it's a village of 600 people, which in China is really minute, it's his home village. It was where he was brought up, and this process of trying to create conditions in which the inhabitants of the village might find a new purpose. What Li Mu noticed in the village was a sort of loss of community, a loss of a sense of why the village is there, a desire to leave and go to the big cities. This is very much one of the crises that, if we talk about sustainability, the move of the population, the Chinese population, from the countryside to the big towns is one of the huge crises which is developing, yeah? which is unsustainable in the most basic sense. And that process was something that he wanted to intervene by starting to produce works based on the collection, originally to think about taking the works there in a sort of Picasso to Palestine idea, but then very quickly developing out of that towards actually reproducing, repurposing, if you like, the works that he found in the collection, studying the collection for the village itself. So this is a proposal of the Daniel Buren stripes to be outside the library, and this is the library itself, and here you see the stripes being set up. Here you see a Solowit, and the wall painting of Solowit, and a Dan Flavin. Here you see that famous Solowit which we produced, which was produced during the time of the Superflex project, and here being used in interior ways, or here rather beautifully being used for bird cages. His father is somebody who looks after birds and goes to the bird market every week. And then he also produced these drawings, some of which you've seen before, which then sort of circulate back into the art market. Yeah, becomes something which then becomes a product which is no longer a reproduction of the Solowit, nor is it totally removed from the context of the Solowit itself. And here you see the Andy Warhol copies of the Andy Warhol Chairman Mao's, which of course is an image that is fairly familiar everywhere. And these images were then put into the village. Here you see a picture of the village finally, which you see is fairly basic. It's a dirt track which sometimes turns into a river when the rains come. And these are the houses on which most of the work is placed. The final project I was going to talk about is a project called the Museum of Arte Util that we did, and I thought I had some images, but we had to change computers and something went wrong here. But that was a project where we tried to look at an archive of useful art, what was called Arte Util because the Spanish term has more of this notion of the tool, yeah, of art as a tool. And we looked all the way back to the 18th century at projects which tried to see art as having a particular purpose, yeah, in this Kantian idea of art having purposeless purpose, yeah, of art being purposeless itself, and that being the definition of art. Again, in this transitional period that we're talking about, I think is one of the things that needs to be challenged, that understanding is something which opens up a certain protocol of what art is, which limits its possibility and its action in the world, its agency. So how do you provide artistic agency back? And unfortunately, I'd like to have shown you some images, but these artworks that we were looking at from the late 19th century onwards were really projects that had a certain functional relevance for particular social groups, There was something like, for instance, an honest shop, which was an artist's project to have a shop which didn't have a till, didn't have a casa, but simply allowed people to take and to donate whatever they thought was valuable. They had a sort of guide price, and then all the production was done locally. So it became this, again, it's quite it's a known formula, but then within the museum, this honest shop itself started to build a community around it, a community of makers who produced the work, and also a community of buyers who would then go to the honest shop and buy it. And that's something that we've been able to sustain by shifting it from the museum to the city hall, and there the honest shop and that community continues to work. There are a number of other projects looking at particular social intervention. Artists like Jana van Heeswijk, who I think was here quite recently, who has done a whole project in Rotterdam looking at the housing schemes in the south and how they can become involved in certain cultural activities which also feed back economically into their own systems. They're fairly marginalised communities in the south of Rotterdam, mostly immigrant communities, that then can use certain skills. There's a project like Silent University by Ahmet Oyut, which again works with immigrant knowledge, which is mostly illegal immigrant knowledge, which is often completely denied. Yeah? When the immigrant comes, maybe has a huge qualification or an important qualification, but isn't allowed to practice their craft, isn't allowed to practice their knowledge within the new society. And this is a way in which a university allowed them to start to lecture or to teach about their particular knowledge within the new society in which they're located. So these projects, which are artistic in the sense that they're being done by artists, artistic in the sense that they try to offer a different kind of agency. And I think ultimately this is the question and the dynamic of our contemporary moment is how do we get a grip on a world which is controlled by an invisible hand? Yeah? How do we get a grip on a world where, even though we see it running out of control, we can't as individuals act on that? And I think artists and the art field is one of the places where we can start to understand what kind of agency we might have. And I think going back to the Walters Prize and to some of the projects that are presented here, I think it shows in different ways how that agency might be made active. Yeah? How the agency of homelessness, how the agency of the relation between the everydayness of life and the spectacular aspect of art might come to be seen to have a relationship which is sustainable, might come to be seen to have a relationship which produces another kind of behaviour out of it, another kind of behaviour which doesn't reproduce the behaviour that we already see, would reproduce this curve, but actually starts us to begin to change our values, to change our value system. Because the only resistance, it seems to me, that's actually effective is simply to say no at this point. And to say no, of course, is one of the most difficult things that we can do. And that process of saying no involves having to replace one set of values with another set of values. Because the only way that you can say no without being some strange Calvinist who wants to say no for some masochistic reason, but the only reason that we can say no is because there's something else we want to say yes to. And that something else that we want to say yes to is something that I think art and artistic agency can start to provide. Thank you very much.
Lots of things on my mind that you've raised. I've been lucky enough in the last couple of years to go to the Van Abbe Museum, particularly to look at the Play Van Abbe project, some of those works that you spoke about there, and a lot of those practices of re-interrogating museum and institutional and artistic thinking are really at the forefront, I think, of trying to re-investigate what we do and how we work in our particular roles. One thing that was on my mind, and I know your interrogation of modernity, modern thinking, and how that can lead, or how our questioning of that can be a powerful force for us in where we're going, is the idea of autonomy, and you've done a lot of thinking and work about that, and is that something now that you think we really need to discard as artists or curators or cultural workers, because it's just so attached to modernity in your idea of finding potential and provisionality for the future in something that is trying to find a wedge through into a new way. So is autonomy something that now we just completely forget?
Yeah, I mean, as part of the Arte Utile, we produced a volume called A Lexicon of Usership, which was thinking about this idea of use. And part of that process was Stephen Wright wrote it, and part of it was to try and see whether we can invent a vocabulary which is more appropriate than the vocabulary we inherit from modernity, in this case from Kant, because autonomy basically goes right back to the idea of the disinterested spectator, which Kant invents as a term to deal with somebody who is not biased in their judgment, because aesthetics in his term is about judgment, and the way that you can judge that is by creating a disinterest, a position which is not connected to the experience, the aesthetic experience which you're having. And autonomy really comes out of that. And of course there are two meanings to autonomy, which is important for us not necessarily to abandon the term. Because one, if we look at the word literally, autonomous, it means to make your own laws. And in a sense, if we think about that in legal structures, if we think about it in political terms, then autonomy might actually be a very important aspect. The whole Italian worker movement from the 70s very much used the idea of autonomy as a way to try and structure its own political thinking. At the same time, autonomy in its artistic sense, its Kantian sense of disinterest, has become used to, in a sense, put art into a playpen. Yeah? To say that art can do what it likes, but that what it likes will have no effect on the world, because its autonomy is also a removal of its consequences from the world. So when we start to talk about art as a tool, then obviously we're transgressing that idea of autonomy, because the purposeless purpose, which is another of Kant's inventions of the relationship that art should have to society, it should be purposeless, and that's indeed its purpose. You know, that process is something which has isolated and decontaminated art from its possibility of affecting our behaviors in ways that are more than a kind of aesthetic, slightly ethical relationship that we might have with the object. So that process of autonomy has become something which has been used in the last 20 or 30 years to diffuse art's effect in the world, and at the same time to give it permission to do what it wants. So the permission that art is given to be autonomous, which is also an absurd thing. How can you be given your autonomy? If you're given your autonomy, then it's not autonomy at all, because you're not doing it from yourself. So you need to take autonomy. And art, I think, has to some extent forgotten that process of taking. So should we get rid of it? I don't think we should get rid of it. We should radically redefine it. And maybe in the process of radically redefining it, we just need another word for the same thing, which could relate to repurposing, or could relate to the idea of the tool, that would become, I think, a more useful way of understanding art.
It's really interesting. And also, Jana van Huyswijk, when she was here last week, did call herself an instrument. She's very happy as an artist to call herself an instrument or a tool. So I like that thinking.
No,
just to turn for a moment to your methodology outside the institution, outside the Art Museum, as a curator of biennales, entering into zones, territories where you're unfamiliar, which you have done, I know. Not you can't be totally unfamiliar, but for example, the São Paulo Biennale in Brazil, which you've just been working on. How do you approach a situation where perhaps you're not part of a history, you're not connected to an indigenous population, you haven't been part of a socio-cultural, political context before? As a curator, how do you approach a situation like that for such a big and important and significant, hopefully, political project?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Is this working, or should I do it? No. Can you hear us if we speak like that? Yeah. Okay. Good. I think I think it's a good question, because it sort of implies an idea that there's my own practice as a curator, I suppose, or the practice of the artists I'm interested in are sort of located, and I think that's true. So obviously the challenge of moving location is to bring a certain amount of baggage with you, but also to try and adapt that baggage for the location in which you find yourself. So it means that you have to invest very much in understanding the new location which you're in, which is a location which is, of course, subject in many senses to the same developments and the same impulses of where you came from. Yeah, we're on the same planet. We are all human beings. So these basic shared elements are ways in which a language can be forged. Yeah? A language which might well involve you speaking Portuguese, but that's not such a difficult thing to do. What's the necessary thing is to understand where this culture is coming from. And of course, you recognize certain things as an outsider that are maybe more obvious to you than they are to somebody embedded in that society. But I think the first step, and that's the one that we took, was to say we had a research budget, and we said we would spend the research budget in Brazil. So we would bring the knowledge that we have internationally would be something that we would bring with us. We don't want to go around the world in some huge environmentally unsustainable airline odyssey. Yeah? They're going around to various things to discover some notion of international art. No, that's what we knew. What we wanted to do was to understand the Brazilian context. So what we did was have a whole series of open meetings, which were structured in around 15 cities in Brazil, where we asked the art community in these various cities to come to us and to tell us about what they thought was urgent or important in their own situation. So it talked a lot about, we arrived in April, and in June 2013, the big protests began. And that was not only in São Paulo, but also, or in Rio, which are the two sort of dominant cities in the country, but also in Recife, in Fortaleza, in Belém. There were a lot of different reasons, actually, in each place for these protests, which spontaneously seemed to be connected because one gave courage to the other, but actually were located in quite different reasons. So these open meetings were allowed us to have a kind of discussion about the localities and to realize that actually São Paulistas, people in São Paulo, have very, very little knowledge or interest of what's going on in the rest of Brazil. Yeah, so actually they were, in the end, I think, more alienated to some extent than we were from what was going on, for instance, in the northeast or in the north, in Belém or in the Amazon. Yeah, because that was not somewhere that their discourse was an essentially a colonial discourse, as you probably know from New Zealand, a colonial discourse with the West, yeah, with the European origins in Portugal and then in the Enlightenment. So that process was something that was very interesting to observe, and I think in the end we ended up with more artists from the northeast and from the southeast, from Rio, Sao Paulo, precisely because we felt that they're in a situation where the idea of product production, new product production, or new product development was far less developed because there wasn't so much of a market. So the artists who were there were having to find different anchors in their societies in order to justify, even to themselves, their own production, their own ways of working. And that was very inspiring in many cases. So I think that for us, that was one of the ways of doing it, was saying, okay, we bring our baggage with us, we accept our status as outsiders, as gringos, and that process is one that we embrace in a certain sense, but we embrace it through trying to find out what this place is that we've been invited to. And then to try and make a biennale, whether we succeeded or not is for history, but the attempt that we made in the biennale was to try and make something which was for Sao Paulo, Brazil, in 2014. Yeah, so it wasn't trying to tell a historical narrative, was not doing the thing that I did in this talk, but actually trying to really focus on the contemporary moment and say, what can we take the temperature of this time through our observation as outsiders of the conditions in Brazil? And that was a very sort of inspiring moment, to understand the Brazilian society in the ways that we understand it. I mean, nobody understands anything, but that we have a position in relationship to Brazilian society which was developed out of those conversations, many conversations with many artists, curators, activists who were working around the country. So I think it was a very privileged opportunity actually to discover a particular context which, as you say, before I started or we started as a group, we had absolutely no clue what was going on, just a series of assumptions that you get from reading, I don't know, The Economist or something.
Right, that's interesting because it links back to your idea of opening up potentialities for a particular place and context. Yeah. Okay, final question from me. I think lots of us know some of the publishing that you've been doing over time, and many of your journal articles and some of the books out of After All Publishing, I'm sure, have been very important for a lot of us, either studying or being inspired for different reasons. And you founded, after all, publishing with Mark Lewis in 1998.
Yeah, many years ago now. Yeah.
St Martin's in Central St Martin's in London, and of course that was the journal, and then turned into the One Work series and the exhibition histories as well, and the critical readers. So now we've got so many other forms of communication apart from print communication online. What are your thoughts about the future of publishing for the arts? Where do you think we can take that, or what do you think the future holds for arts publishing?
I mean, the interesting thing is we're basically subsidised, as a publisher, which is something that's I think we're very privileged to be in. So clearly, if we weren't subsidised, then we'd have to go online with everything. So the destruction of the forest, which is in a sense the production of paper publications, is something which is at the moment subsidised by the English state, it's not quite an English state, it's a British state, but more or less by the English state. And that process is something that I think we're still quite privileged to do. So we don't have to interrogate the need to produce these books in that sense, in an economic sense, because of that subsidy that we get. Nevertheless, I think that what you notice is that the effectiveness of book production is becoming less, because actually when articles are quoted, or where particular texts seem to be of significance, there are often things which are now distributed over the internet. I'm thinking about Eflux Journal, which I think is a good example of that. And I think that that's something that I think we are, and after all, we are behind, in the ways in which we can get the knowledge which we produce out into the world. So there might be another reason why we would want to stop cutting down trees and producing paper books. Which would be precisely that if you see the knowledge that's being produced in something like the After All Journal being something that you want to circulate. The interest is in the circulation of that knowledge rather than the production of some iconic block of paper. And if you change that approach, then even if you have the money to produce it, it no longer maybe makes so much sense, because then you can inject that money into other forms of distribution, other forms of circulation. And then perhaps you need to then ask the question of what is the value of the paper book, because I think it still might have a certain value. But that value is no longer the one of information distribution. It's something which becomes more related maybe to the physical experience that you have with this object, and how that physical experience might be different from the relationship you have with a screen, which we all have screens. We do little and big screens, but we're basically all working through screens all the time. So is there this old-fashioned idea of having a book and actually turning the pages and turning those pages and seeing a relationship which is developed between pages? Is that something which still has a validity to it? And I think that's one of the questions that we have at the moment. Like, are we maximizing the potential of that physical experience, or are we simply just reproducing the protocols of what it is to make an art journal? And at the other hand, are we really committing ourselves to distribute the information that we produce in a way which it can reach the maximum number of people? And I think we'll change. I mean, it's an internal discussion at the moment with different viewpoints. I have quite a clear one, but it's a cooperative. So it's something that we have to work and to persuade other people that giving up or changing the nature of the print published element is something that's important to do. All institutions have their inbuilt conservatism, no? So you have to.
Thank you. So time for a couple of questions from the floor. Someone wants to raise their hand if they have a question. Still thinking. Well, it looks like we might let you off with additional questions and get you something nice and cold to drink. So if there's no more questions, let's thank Charles again for his great lecture.